I want to tell you why you are so eager to believe that the law has been abolished. It is your carnal mind. The Word of God describes you to a T, Romans 8 and verse 7. Because the carnal mind is enmity against God, for it is not subject to the law of God, neither indeed can be. You know, when I think about it, you have to find those verses. You have no other choice. You have to find those verses that say the law's been abolished. It's been nailed because of how you want to live your life, really. But you have no other choice, and that's sort of a scary thought. But this verse tells us that the way we naturally come into the world, we are at enmity against the law of God. We cannot be subject to the law of God, and that explains our carnality. And until God smites you down and brings you to a conviction of the law of God, and until you surrender to that law where you have this enmity against, I don't want to keep it, I don't want to do it, I don't want to submit to it, until you come to a point where you hold up your little white flag and say, I surrender all. I surrender my will to your will, and I will do what you tell me to do. Till you come to that, there's not real conversion. There can be no real conversion. The carnal mind is enmity against God. It is not subject to the law of God, neither indeed can be. We're talking about the need for real conversion here. Just because you go to church, just because you can explain all your proof texts and all your verses that say that where you think it says the law's been abolished, been nailed to the cross, been done away with, just because you think you got it all down pat doesn't mean you're converted. The fact that you have enmity against God's law reveals what's really going on in your life. You've never been converted in the first place. Colossians 2 and verse 20, wherefore, if you be dead with Christ from the rudiments of the world, why, as though living in the world, are you subject to ordinances? Now, what were these ordinances? Here they are. Touch not, taste not, handle not, which are all to perish with the using after the commandments and doctrines of men. Notice that, after the commandments and doctrines of men. We're not talking about the commandments of God. We're not talking about the 10 commandments. We're talking about the commandments and doctrines of men. This is what the ordinances were. Christ referred to these humanly devised ordinances. Mark 7 and verse 6. He answered and said to them, well, as Isaiah has prophesied of you, hypocrites, as it is written, these people honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Howbeit in vain do they worship me, teaching, here it is, for doctrines the commandments of men. Here we have connected up Mark 7 and verse 7 with Colossians 2 verse 22, which are all to perish with the using after the commandments and doctrines of men. So we have identified the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, and it's not the 10 commandments, for pity's sakes. Mark 7 and verse 8, for laying aside the commandments of God, you hold the traditions of men, as the washing of pots and cups and many other such like things you do. You remember the incident with Jesus where it's in Matthew 15 and verse 1, then came to Jesus scribes and Pharisees, which were of Jerusalem, saying, why do thy disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they wash not their hands when they eat bread. Now this is a direct reference to the oral law of the Jews. This little statement, transgress the tradition of the elders, was a reference to the oral law of the Jews. The oral law of the Jews, first of all, it separated Jew from Gentiles. They were man-made. They were traditions of men. They were ordinances. It was fence building around the law of God, which we are supposed to keep. But they built their oral tradition around the law of God, which defined every nuance of what you could and could not do. Now, when Jesus came on the scene, they had placed their oral tradition, the tradition of the elders, on a par with the 10 Commandments, actually above the 10 Commandments. And Jesus comes along and says, oh, no, these traditions of men, these oral laws, the tradition of the elders, these ordinances are going to have to go. Now, if you want to know what was nailed to the cross, here it is. It was the oral law of the Jews that separated Jew from Gentile. It's just that simple.
Check us out on the web at isthatreallyinthebible.com.